Are you up 2 or 3 times a night, sitting on the edge of the bed for a minute before you can even make it to the bathroom? Does the pressure seem to hit hardest right after you eat, especially after something sweet or heavy, and you've never once thought to connect the two? I lived that exact pattern for years without asking why the timing was so consistent, until a nurse at an urgent care visit glanced at my chart at 2 in the morning and said something I never expected. Your blood sugar's been climbing for years, hasn't it? I hadn't come in about my blood sugar. I'd come in about the pressure and burning down below that had finally gotten bad enough to scare me. But she wasn't wrong, and it wasn't the first time someone had mentioned it in passing without connecting it to anything. A large share of men over 60 carry some degree of insulin resistance without ever being told, and almost none of us are told it might have anything to do with the prostate discomfort we've been quietly living with for years. I still see my doctor every year, still let him run his full panel of tests, and I don't dread that visit anymore the way I used to. I split a full cord of firewood last fall with my neighbor, a whole Saturday of steady work, and I didn't spend a single hour of it thinking about my bladder. I'm not telling you that to boast. I'm telling you because 3 years ago I would have found a reason to sit that Saturday out entirely. But before I tell you what actually changed things, I want to walk you through the mechanism, because if I just say, watch your blood sugar, you'll nod politely and forget it by lunchtime, and that's not what I want for you. I want you to actually understand why this matters, the way I finally did, after years of 2 separate problems that turned out to be one problem wearing 2 faces. For most of my 60s and into my 70s, I treated my slightly elevated blood sugar and my prostate discomfort as completely unrelated facts about my aging body. One doctor managed my blood work. Another, or sometimes the same one in a different 8-minute appointment, managed my urinary symptoms. Nobody ever sat the 2 conversations next to each other and said, these might be talking about the same underlying problem. I don't think it was neglect, exactly. It's just how a rushed system works. Specialists and short visits, each one looking at a narrow slice of you instead of the whole picture. Here's what I eventually pieced together, partly from my own reading and partly from a conversation with a retired physician friend who finally connected the dots for me over coffee one Sunday. When a man develops insulin resistance, meaning his cells stop responding normally to insulin, so the body compensates by producing more and more of it just to keep blood sugar in a workable range, that chronically elevated insulin doesn't stay contained to the bloodstream doing its normal job. It circulates everywhere, including through prostate tissue. And insulin, at persistently high levels, appears to act as a growth signal through a related pathway involving a substance called IGF-1. Insulin-like growth factor. Research looking at metabolic syndrome, the cluster of insulin resistance, extra abdominal weight, elevated blood pressure, and unhealthy cholesterol that so many of us quietly carry, has found a consistent association with larger prostate volume and more severe urinary symptoms. Not a coincidence sitting next to aging, a driver working underneath it, independent of testosterone, independent of the calendar. That last part is what really stopped me. Independent of testosterone. Most men assume, the way I did, that whatever's happening down there must be about male hormone levels rising or falling. But testosterone actually tends to decline as men age, not rise. If the prostate keeps growing anyway, something else has to be pushing it. For a lot of men, that something else is chronically elevated insulin, quietly doing damage no doctor's visit had ever named out loud for me. I sat with that idea for days. Every year of my life, I'd assumed my prostate and my slowly climbing blood sugar were 2 separate conversations happening on 2 separate visits, managed by 2 separate parts of my chart. It had never once occurred to me that the same elevated insulin circulating through my bloodstream while my doctor lectured me gently about dessert was the same insulin circulating through the exact tissue that had me up 3 times a night. 2 problems, 1 root, and 15 years of nobody connecting them out loud. The retired physician friend I mentioned put it to me plainly, the way only someone who's left the rushed pace of practice behind really can. We're trained to treat the number in front of us, he said. Your fasting glucose gets one conversation. Your urinary symptoms get a completely different one, sometimes with a different specialist entirely. Nobody's job in that system is to stand back and ask what's connecting them. That answer didn't make me angry at any one doctor. It made me understand for the first time why I'd had to find this out for myself at 83 instead of at 65. For years, one number ran my life, the PSA. It would tick up a point and I'd lie awake the whole night, certain it meant the worst, picturing the biopsy, the knife, the end of everything. Then someone finally told me the truth no doctor had. That number doesn't measure cancer, it measures your prostate. And as we age, it climbs mostly because the gland is simply enlarging, benign, swollen, and uncomfortable, not the worst. The number was scaring me half to death over something ordinary. And the prescriptions they push to shrink it? They can flatten your drive completely, soften everything, quietly take the man right out of you. I wasn't willing to trade that away. There's a gentle way to support that gland, keep it comfortable, a healthy size, without surrendering any of that. Keep getting checked every year, of course. At 83, that number doesn't own me anymore. I finally have peace. Let me show you what gave it to me in this video. And if you want the simple support I personally use, there's a free presentation linked in the description below. That reframe sent me looking for what I could actually do about it. And it's where Jethro's story became important to me. Jethro was the retired physician friend's longtime patient before he retired. A man in his late 70s who'd had the exact same doubled-up problem. Elevated blood sugar and worsening prostate symptoms, treated as two separate stories for over a decade. What finally moved things for Jethro, and eventually for me once I heard about it, wasn't a dramatic overhaul. It was a handful of specific, sustainable changes aimed squarely at improving insulin sensitivity, not just treating the prostate symptoms directly. The first piece was reducing refined carbohydrates and added sugar. Not eliminating them entirely because nobody sustains that kind of rigidity for years, but cutting them back hard. White bread, sugary drinks, the desserts that had become an automatic habit rather than an actual pleasure. Every time blood sugar spikes sharply and then crashes, it demands another surge of insulin to correct it. Fewer spikes meant less of that chronic insulin overproduction driving the growth signal in prostate tissue. The second piece was moving my body after meals specifically, not just at some point during the day. A short walk, 10 or 15 minutes right after eating. Research has shown that light activity after a meal measurably improves how efficiently the body clears sugar from the bloodstream, which means less insulin is needed to do the job. It's a small window of time with an outsized effect, and it cost me nothing but a few minutes I used to spend sitting in the recliner digesting. The third piece was something Jethro's story had taught me before I even lived it myself. Light, intermittent gaps between meals, giving the body real stretches of time without a constant trickle of food to respond to. Not extreme fasting, nothing dramatic, just a longer overnight stretch between dinner and breakfast than I'd been giving myself for years, cutting out the late-night snacking that had quietly become routine. That gap appears to give the body's insulin system a genuine rest period instead of running at low simmer around the clock. None of these three changes were revolutionary on their own. Plenty of people have heard some version of each one before, usually in the context of diabetes prevention, rarely connected to prostate comfort specifically. What made the difference for me was understanding why I was doing them, not just eat less sugar as a vague health slogan, but reduce the specific signal that's been quietly pushing my prostate to keep growing for years. That understanding is what made the changes stick, where a dozen vague diet attempts before it hadn't. There was a fourth piece, too, one I almost didn't take seriously at first because it sounded too simple. Sleep, and specifically, protecting it. Poor sleep and chronic stress both raise cortisol, and elevated cortisol interferes with normal insulin function, pushing the whole system in the same unhelpful direction as too much sugar and too little movement. I'd spent years treating my restless nights as purely a symptom of the pressure down below, never once considering that the poor sleep itself might be feeding the very problem keeping me awake. Fixing my sleep schedule, a consistent bedtime, a dark room, no phone glowing an hour before lights out, wasn't a separate project from the rest. It was one more piece of the same system, working in the same direction as everything else. I also had to be honest with myself about portion sizes, something I'd avoided looking at squarely for years. It wasn't just what I was eating, it was how much and how often. I'd developed a habit of grazing through the evening, a handful of something every hour or so while watching television, never a single big meal, but a constant low trickle of food that kept insulin working nearly around the clock. Closing that kitchen down after dinner, giving my body real, uninterrupted stretches of rest from digestion, turned out to matter as much as anything else I changed. I kept a small notebook the way Jethro apparently had, tracking a few simple things each morning: how the night had gone, roughly how I'd eaten the day before. Comparing my first 2 weeks to 2 months later, the trend line wasn't dramatic day to day, but across the stretch it was undeniable. Fewer trips overnight. Less of that heavy, urgent pressure that used to hit right after meals, which made a strange kind of sense once I understood the insulin connection. I'll admit I was skeptical through most of the first month, the way I imagine you might be right now listening to this. 83 years old, and I'm supposed to believe that walking after dinner and eating dessert less often is going to succeed where years of prescriptions barely touched things? But the notebook doesn't flatter you, and mine didn't try to. Week 1, I was up most nights 3 or 4 times, the pressure sharp enough some nights that I'd sit on the edge of the bed for a few minutes before even standing. By week 10, 2 wake-ups had become the ordinary night, and there were stretches where 1 was enough. I wasn't cured, and I want to say that plainly because anyone promising a cure isn't being honest with you. But I was measurably, undeniably better, in a way a notebook full of honest numbers doesn't let you talk yourself out of. What surprised me most, looking back over those months, was how much of my daily rhythm had quietly been built around managing symptoms instead of living a life. I'd stopped going to the early service at church because it meant a longer stretch without a bathroom nearby. I'd stopped accepting invitations to the lake house because the drive was 90 minutes each way. Piece by piece, without ever deciding to, I'd shrunk my own world down to fit the size of my discomfort. Watching that world open back up, slowly, month over month, was worth more to me than the numbers in the notebook ever could have said on their own. I remember standing in my kitchen a few months in, realizing I'd gone an entire holiday dinner, dessert included in moderation, without once excusing myself mid-conversation. It felt small and enormous at the same time. These days I take long Sunday drives with my wife along the coast without mapping every rest stop first, and that kind of quiet, ordinary freedom means more to me now than almost anything else I could name at 83. I want to be honest about something important here, because this channel doesn't exist to frighten anyone into anything. Prostate discomfort and an enlarged prostate are not cancer, and having elevated blood sugar or insulin resistance doesn't mean your cancer risk has automatically gone up. What I've described is a metabolic mechanism tied to comfort and gland size, not a diagnosis to spiral over. It's a problem with real, workable levers once somebody finally explains what's actually driving it. And I want to be just as clear about this. Nothing here means skipping a single doctor's visit or backing off any medication you're on. Keep getting checked every year on schedule and let your doctor manage what he's trained to manage, your blood work, your prostate exams, all of it. What I changed was how I supported my own body day to day between those visits. Those are 2 different, equally important jobs. I told my doctor plainly what I'd changed: the eating pattern, the after-meal walks, the earlier dinners, and he had no objection at all. He just kept doing his part while I finally started doing mine. Here's what I settled on: a few drops a day. And let me tell you why it works. 1 compound calms 1 signal, but a swollen prostate answers when several are calmed at once: the growth signal, the inflammation, the pressure inside it. So what I use concentrates them, working as one, the way the research actually uses them, not a single ingredient pretending to be enough. A gland that stays comfortable and a healthy size, fewer trips, and the quiet of no longer fearing that number. It leaves the man fully intact, none of that flattening the prescriptions can do. It's linked right under this video, go look for yourself. It won't replace your doctor or your yearly check. It supports the biology right alongside them. I'm 83, and that number doesn't own me anymore. What I want you to walk away with is this. The discomfort you've been carrying might not be 2 unrelated problems, one about blood sugar and one about your prostate. For a lot of men, it's one story, quietly feeding itself for years because nobody ever connected the 2 conversations happening in 2 different exam rooms. Once you see the connection, you have an actual lever to pull, not just a burden to endure. I think about the man who sat in that urgent care waiting room at 2 in the morning, certain something catastrophic was wrong. And I think about the man I am now, the one who understands what his own body has actually been doing for the better part of a decade. That's not a miracle. That's just information, finally given to me in a form I could act on, and dignity, quietly rebuilt one ordinary choice at a time. If any of this sounds like your story, tell me in the comments how long you've carried it, whether anyone ever connected your blood sugar to your prostate before, what's actually helped. I read every one of them myself. And if this gave you a piece of the picture nobody handed you before, subscribe, because there's a lot more I've learned that I still want to share with you.